The notification chimed on my phone at 11:47 p.m., 3 months after the worst day of my life had somehow transformed into the best. The message was from a stranger, but the video attachment would change everything I thought I knew about betrayal, technology, and the peculiar ways the universe delivers justice. I should have been sleeping. Maybe Emma had finally settled after her evening feeding, and tomorrow marked exactly 91 days since the christening, since David walked out of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church and out of our lives forever. Or so I thought. The message read simply, "You need to see this. Check the timestamp." My finger hovered over the play button, trembling slightly. The thumbnail showed the familiar interior of our church, the same Gothic arches and stained glass windows where I'd stood 3 months ago, holding our daughter while my world cracked apart like an eggshell. But something was different about this footage. Something that would soon reveal the thread I'd pulled to unravel David's entire carefully constructed deception. I pressed play. The morning of Emma's christening dawned with the kind of pristine autumn light that photographers chase and poets attempt to capture in verse. Golden leaves drifted past our bedroom window like nature's confetti, and for a brief, shining moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything would be perfect. David stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with the meticulous precision that had first attracted me to him 7 years ago. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit pressed to sharp creases. He caught my reflection in the mirror and smiled, the same boyish grin that had made me fall in love with him during our first date at that tiny Italian restaurant downtown. Emma gurgled contentedly in her antique lace christening gown, a family heirloom that had adorned 5 generations of babies on my mother's side. The delicate fabric pooled around her tiny form like seafoam, and her dark eyes, David's eyes, tracked the morning sunbeams dancing across the ceiling. I should have noticed the signs then. The way David's hands shook slightly as he knotted his tie. The distant look that clouded his features when he thought I wasn't watching. The phone calls he'd been taking in the garage, his voice dropping to whispers whenever I approached. But love has a way of making us willfully blind to the cracks in our foundation, and I was desperate to preserve the illusion of our happy family on this sacred day. The drive to St. Matthew's was filled with the comfortable silence of a couple who'd been together long enough to communicate without words. David's hand rested on my knee as he navigated the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the coffee shop where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings reading the paper together, past the park where he'd proposed 3 years ago beside the duck pond. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church had been our spiritual home since we'd moved to town 5 years earlier. The Gothic Revival building stood like a fortress of faith at the corner of Maple and 3rd, its limestone walls weathered to a soft gray that spoke of decades of prayers and celebrations. The bell tower stretched toward heaven, and on clear days like this one, you could see the cross from 3 blocks away. We'd chosen this church for Emma's christening not just because of its beauty, but because of the warmth of its congregation and the gentle wisdom of Father Morrison, who'd counseled us through the early challenges of marriage and celebrated with us when we'd finally conceived after 2 years of trying. The parking lot was already filling with familiar faces, my parents, who'd driven down from Portland, David's sister Rebecca with her twins, our friends from book club, work colleagues, neighbors who'd become like family. Everyone had come to witness this milestone in Emma's spiritual journey, to celebrate the newest addition to our church family. But as we walked toward the sanctuary, David's steps seemed to falter. He paused at the entrance, his face pale beneath his carefully applied aftershave. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, shifting Emma to one arm so I could touch his forehead. He pulled back slightly, forcing another smile. "Just nervous. You know how I get with public speaking." It was true. David had always been uncomfortable with attention, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than take center stage. I attributed his anxiety to the formal nature of the ceremony, the expectation that he would stand before our community and make promises about our daughter's spiritual upbringing. The church interior was breathtaking in the morning light. Sunbeams streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews and stone floors. White lilies adorned the altar, their fragrance mingling with the lingering scent of incense from the early service. The Gothic arches soared overhead like prayers made manifest in stone and mortar. Father Morrison greeted us at the altar rail, his kind face creased with genuine joy. He baptized dozens of babies in his 30-year tenure at St. Matthew's, but he approached each ceremony with the reverence of someone who truly understood the sacred nature of the sacrament. Our families and friends filled the first 3 pews, their faces glowing with anticipation. My mother clutched a tissue, already emotional despite the ceremony not having begun. David's father adjusted his camera, determined to capture every moment for posterity. But it was the small red light blinking in the corner that would prove most significant, though none of us knew it at the time. St. Matthew's had recently installed a new live streaming system, allowing shut-in parishioners and distant family members to participate in services remotely. The camera, barely noticeable in its mounting above the side chapel, faithfully recorded everything that transpired within its wide-angle view. Everything. As Father Morrison began the opening prayers, I felt David's tension like a living thing beside me. His jaw was clenched, his breathing shallow. Emma seemed to sense the atmosphere, fussing slightly in her elaborate gown. I assumed it was pre-ceremony nerves, the weight of the moment, the significance of the vows we were about to make on behalf of our daughter. I had no idea that David was already planning his exit strategy. The ceremony proceeded according to the ancient liturgy that had bound Christian families together for centuries. Father Morrison spoke eloquently about the mystery of baptism, the washing away of original sin, the welcoming of a new soul into the community of faith. Emma behaved perfectly, sleeping peacefully through most of the service, stirring only when the holy water touched her forehead. But during the section where parents and godparents pledged to raise the child in the Christian faith, something shifted in David's demeanor. His responses became mechanical, his voice hollow. When Father Morrison asked if we renounced Satan and all his works, David's "I do" sounded more like a question than an affirmation. The baptism itself was beautiful. Emma opened her eyes as the water trickled over her head, gazing up at Father Morrison with the serene curiosity of innocence encountering the sacred. Our friends and family smiled through tears of joy, and for a moment, I felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you're part of something larger than yourself. Then came the moment that would change everything. After the formal ceremony concluded, as our guests began to gather for the reception in the parish hall, David pulled me aside near the side altar. His face was ashen, his hands trembling visibly now. "Sarah," he began, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. The words that followed would replay in my mind for months afterward, each syllable carved into my memory with the precision of a chisel on stone. He spoke about feeling trapped, about mistakes he'd made, about needing to find himself. The phrases were cliched, the kind of breakup speech that might have come from a bad romantic comedy, but the devastation they caused was entirely real. He was leaving. Not just the marriage, but everything, me, Emma, the life we'd built together. He'd already retained a lawyer, already found an apartment across town. His bags were packed and waiting in the trunk of his car. The cruelest part wasn't the abandonment itself, but the timing. He'd waited until after the christening, he explained, because he didn't want to ruin Emma's special day. As if destroying a family in the immediate aftermath somehow minimized the damage. I stood there in my cream-colored dress, holding our freshly baptized daughter, surrounded by the lingering scent of lilies and the echoing voices of our celebrating guests, and felt my world collapse inward like a dying star. David kissed Emma's forehead once, briefly, then walked away without looking back. I watched him navigate through the crowd of well-wishers, accepting congratulations and making excuses about needing to step outside for air. Most of our guests assumed he was overwhelmed by emotion, which, in a way, he was. The last I saw of him that day was a silhouette disappearing through the church's heavy wooden doors, leaving me to explain his absence to 60 confused relatives and friends who'd come to celebrate what they thought was the beginning of our family's spiritual journey, not the end of our marriage. The weeks following the christening passed in a blur of legal consultations, sleepless nights, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to hold yourself together while your entire foundation crumbles beneath you. Emma, mercifully, was too young to understand the chaos surrounding her tiny world. She continued to sleep, eat, and observe her surroundings with the same peaceful curiosity she'd shown during her baptism. I moved through the motions of single motherhood like an actress playing a role she'd never auditioned for. Feeding schedules, diaper changes, pediatric appointments, the mechanical necessities of caring for an infant provided structure to days that otherwise threatened to dissolve into self-pity and rage. The hardest part wasn't the practical challenges of raising a baby alone, though those were considerable. It was the constant presence of Emma's eyes, David's eyes, looking up at me with absolute trust and dependence. Every time I saw that familiar dark gaze, I was reminded of the man who'd created this perfect little person and then abandoned her without a backward glance. David's lawyer had been swift and efficient. The divorce papers arrived via certified mail 2 weeks after the christening, accompanied by a custody arrangement that was laughably generous in my favor. He wanted minimal visitation rights, no shared custody, and seemed perfectly willing to reduce his relationship with Emma to monthly child support payments processed through the state. His friends and colleagues, when I encountered them around town, offered awkward condolences and vague explanations about David needing space to find himself. A few mentioned seeing him at restaurants or bars, always alone, looking haunted. His sister Rebecca called once to apologize on behalf of the family, but even she seemed baffled by her brother's behavior. "He's not answering anyone's calls," she told me during that awkward conversation. "Even Mom can't reach him. It's like he's disappeared." But he hadn't disappeared entirely. Through the peculiar surveillance network of a small town, I received periodic updates on David's new life. He'd rented a studio apartment above the downtown bakery. He'd taken a leave of absence from his accounting firm. He'd been seen buying groceries alone, walking the Riverside Trail alone, sitting in his car in various parking lots, staring at nothing. For someone who'd claimed he needed freedom, he seemed utterly lost in it. Meanwhile, Emma continued to grow and develop with the relentless optimism of infancy. She began sleeping through the night, smiling at her reflection in mirrors, reaching for toys with increasingly coordinated movements. Her personality emerged in small increments, a preference for yellow stuffed animals over blue ones, a fascination with ceiling fans, a distinctive giggle that sounded remarkably like David's laugh. The church community rallied around us with the kind of practical compassion that makes faith meaningful. Casseroles appeared on my doorstep without explanation. Teenage babysitters volunteered their services for free. The Women's Auxiliary organized a schedule of visitors to help with housework and provide adult conversation during the lonely evening hours. Father Morrison stopped by regularly, not to offer hollow platitudes about God's plan, but simply to sit with Emma and me, sharing coffee and quiet companionship. He never asked about David directly, but I could see the concern in his eyes, not just for my abandonment, but for the man who'd walked away from such blessing. "Sometimes," he said during one of these visits, "people make choices that hurt them more than anyone else. The tragedy isn't just what David's done to you and Emma. It's what he's done to himself." I wasn't ready to feel sympathy for David yet, but Father Morrison's words planted a seed that would bloom later, when I finally understood the full scope of my husband's deception. 2 months after the christening, I began the slow process of rebuilding my identity as a single mother. I returned to work part-time, grateful for the flexibility my employer offered and the distraction of adult responsibilities. Emma thrived in daycare, charming the staff with her sunny disposition and proving remarkably adaptable to new routines. Evenings were the hardest. After Emma went to sleep, the house felt cavernous and silent. I'd walk through rooms that still contained traces of David's presence, a coffee mug he'd forgotten in the sink, a book marked with his reading glasses on the nightstand, the indent in his pillow that hadn't quite disappeared despite weeks of sleeping alone. I began to understand why some people describe divorce as a form of death, not just the death of a relationship, but the death of the future you'd imagine together. The family vacations that would never happen, the bedtime stories David would never read, the milestone moments he'd chosen to miss. But anger, I discovered, could be a useful emotion when channeled constructively. I threw myself into creating the best possible life for Emma and me. I researched preschools, investigated college savings plans, and began the process of refinancing our mortgage so I could afford the house payments alone. I also started documenting everything: David's abandonment, his minimal contact with Emma, his apparent indifference to his daughter's welfare. My lawyer had assured me that his behavior would work heavily in my favor during custody proceedings, but I wanted a complete record nonetheless. It was during this documentation process that I first began to suspect there might be more to David's story than simple midlife crisis and commitment phobia. The timeline of his departure was too precise, too well planned. He'd known exactly when to serve papers, exactly how much money to offer in support, exactly how to structure the custody arrangement to minimize his obligations. Someone had advised him. Someone with experience in family law and strategic thinking. Someone who understood how to execute a clean break with maximum efficiency and minimum liability. But who? And why had they chosen the day of our daughter's christening to implement their plan? The questions multiplied as I began to notice other inconsistencies in David's behavior during the weeks leading up to the ceremony. The garage phone calls made more sense now. He'd been coordinating with his lawyer, finalizing arrangements, preparing for his exit. But there had been other calls, too, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room, numbers that appeared repeatedly on our phone bill but weren't associated with any legal offices. 3 months after the christening, I was no closer to understanding David's motivations, but I'd accepted that I might never need to. Emma and I were building a good life together. We had our health, our home, our community of support. David's absence was painful, but it was becoming a familiar pain, like a scar that aches in bad weather but doesn't prevent you from functioning. Then came the message that changed everything. The stranger's name was Marcus, and his message had found me through a circuitous route that spoke to both the connectivity and randomness of modern life. Marcus was a software engineer living in California, but his elderly grandmother attended services at St. Matthew's through the church's livestream system. She'd mentioned seeing a disturbing incident during a recent baptism, something that bothered her enough to ask Marcus to investigate. Marcus had accessed the archived footage from Emma's christening, the same ceremony I'd been trying to forget for 3 months. But where I'd been focused on the emotional devastation of David's abandonment, Marcus had noticed something else entirely: the timestamp discrepancy. The video he sent showed the church interior during our ceremony, but the timestamp in the corner read 11 minutes earlier than the official start time. It was a small glitch in the streaming software, the kind of technical error that would be meaningless to most viewers. But Marcus was the kind of person who noticed such things, and his curiosity had led him to examine the full archived footage more carefully. What he found in those 11 minutes would shatter everything I thought I knew about that Sunday morning. The pre-ceremony footage showed David arriving at the church alone, 45 minutes before our agreed meeting time. I watched in stunned silence as my husband, the man I'd thought was home getting ready while I fed and dressed Emma, walked purposefully toward the side chapel where he knelt in apparent prayer. But he wasn't praying. He was on his phone. The camera's audio wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to catch fragments of David's conversation. Words like "scheduled," "after the ceremony," and "no going back" drifted across the sanctuary's acoustic space. Most tellingly, I heard him say, "She has no idea. This will be completely clean." My hand shook as I paused the video. The implications were staggering. David hadn't suffered a sudden crisis of faith or commitment during the christening ceremony. He'd planned his departure meticulously, coordinating it with someone who'd helped him strategize the timing and execution. But the revelation that destroyed me completely came in the final minutes of the pre-ceremony footage. As David ended his phone call and prepared to leave the chapel, a woman entered the frame from the side door near the altar. I knew her immediately, though it took several moments for my brain to process what I was seeing. Rebecca Martinez had been David's colleague at the accounting firm for 3 years. She'd also been a guest at our wedding, a dinner party regular at our house, and someone I'd considered a friend. She'd sent a beautiful flower arrangement when Emma was born and had even helped me plan the christening reception. The camera captured them in an embrace that was anything but platonic. David's hands tangled in her dark hair while she pressed against him with the desperate urgency of lovers who'd been forced apart. They kissed with the passion of people who'd been hiding their relationship for far too long, and when they finally separated, their whispered conversation was just audible enough for me to catch the essential details. The affair had been going on for over a year. Rebecca was divorced, childless, and eager to start fresh with David somewhere far from the complications of his current life. She convinced him that staying in our marriage was unfair to everyone involved, that Emma deserved a father who truly wanted to be present rather than one who felt trapped by obligation. The christening had been chosen as David's departure point because of its symbolic significance. In Rebecca's twisted logic, ending our marriage immediately after Emma's baptism represented a clean slate for everyone involved. Emma would be welcomed into the church community just as David was leaving it behind. But the most devastating part of their conversation came when David expressed last-minute doubts about abandoning Emma. Rebecca's response was captured with perfect clarity by the church's recording system. "She's not even your biological daughter, David. The paternity test proved that months ago. You don't owe her anything." The world stopped. I replayed that section of the video 3 times, certain I'd misheard. But Rebecca's words were unmistakable, and David's response, a pained nod and whispered, "I know, but she feels like mine," confirmed the bombshell that had just exploded my understanding of everything. Emma wasn't David's daughter. The paternity test Rebecca mentioned must have been conducted without my knowledge, probably using DNA samples taken from Emma's pacifier or clothing. The results would have been devastating for David, explaining his emotional distance during the final months of my pregnancy and his increasing detachment after Emma's birth. But if David wasn't Emma's father, then who was? The answer came to me in a rush of memory and mortification. 18 months ago, during a rough patch in our marriage when David had been traveling frequently for work, I'd made a terrible mistake. A conference in Seattle, too much wine at the hotel bar, and a night with Dr. James Sullivan that I'd immediately regretted and never repeated. James was a pediatric surgeon, brilliant and charming, with dark eyes and the kind of easy confidence that had momentarily made me forget my wedding vows. We talked for hours about medicine, literature, and the loneliness of professional life. One thing led to another, and by morning, I was on a plane home, determined to never think about that night again. I confessed to David 2 weeks later, consumed by guilt and desperate to clear the air between us. His forgiveness had seemed complete and immediate. We'd gone to counseling, renewed our commitment to each other, and emerged from the crisis stronger than before. When I became pregnant 3 months later, we were both overjoyed, assuming the timing meant Emma was conceived during our reconciliation period. Apparently, David had never been as certain about the timing as I was. The video continued with Rebecca and David's final goodbye. She would drive separately to her sister's house in Denver, where David would meet her after the ceremony. They'd already secured new jobs in Colorado, already found an apartment, already planned their escape from the wreckage of David's old life. As I watched my husband kiss another woman in our church sanctuary, promising her a future that included abandoning his wife and the child he'd raised as his own for 3 months, I felt something die inside me that I hadn't even known was still alive. But something else was born in that moment, too. A fierce, protective rage that burned away the last traces of self-doubt and recrimination I'd been carrying since the christening. David's betrayal was complete and calculated, but it was also documented in high-definition video with crystal-clear audio, timestamped and archived on the church's server. Rebecca Martinez had forgotten about the live stream camera when she'd chosen our sanctuary for her clandestine meeting with my husband. In her eagerness to coordinate their new life together, she'd provided me with evidence of adultery, conspiracy, and fraud that would destroy David's carefully constructed narrative of needing space to find himself. I spent the rest of that night watching the video repeatedly, taking screenshots, making notes, and planning my next moves. By morning, I had a strategy that would ensure David faced consequences for his deception, even if those consequences came too late to save our marriage. But first, I had a phone call to make to Dr. James Sullivan. Dr. James Sullivan's voice on the phone carried the same warm baritone that had charmed me during that regrettable night in Seattle 18 months ago. When I explained who I was and why I was calling, the long pause that followed spoke volumes about his capacity for quick mental calculations. Emma, he repeated carefully, as if testing the name's weight. You think she might be. I know she is, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. David had a paternity test done. Emma isn't his daughter. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear the subtle sounds of a hospital environment, muffled announcements, the soft beeping of monitors, the quiet efficiency of medical professionals going about their work. What do you want from me, Sarah? The question was fair, and I'd spent hours considering my answer. What did I want from the man who'd unknowingly fathered my daughter during my moment of infidelity? What did I owe him, and what did he owe Emma? I want you to know she exists, I said finally. I want you to understand that our mistake created something beautiful, even if the circumstances were complicated. Are you asking for child support? Legal recognition? I'm not asking for anything, I replied, and meant it. I'm offering you the choice David never had. The choice to know your daughter or not, without deception or pressure. The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary. James had never married, had no other children, and had spent the past 18 months occasionally wondering about the married woman from the medical conference who disappeared from his life as quickly as she'd entered it. He'd respected my silence, assuming I'd chosen to focus on repairing my marriage. Learning about Emma's existence was clearly overwhelming for him, but his response was markedly different from David's calculated abandonment. James asked practical questions about Emma's health, her development, her needs. He requested photographs, which I sent immediately, watching my phone for his reaction. When he called back 20 minutes later, his voice was thick with emotion. She has my eyes, he said simply. Yes, everyone always said she had David's eyes, but they were wrong. Can I meet her? The request wasn't unexpected, but it still sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Introducing Emma to her biological father would complicate our already complex situation exponentially. But looking at my daughter, who was playing contentedly with her stuffed animals in the living room, I realized she deserved to know the truth about her parentage, even if she was too young to understand it now. Yes, I said, but slowly, and on my terms. James agreed without argument. We arranged for him to visit the following weekend, giving us both time to process the implications of our new reality. He would stay at a local hotel, spend a few hours getting to know Emma, and then we'd figure out next steps based on how everyone felt. Meanwhile, I had other business to attend to. My lawyer, Patricia Hendricks, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in complex family law cases. When I shared the church video with her, her reaction was immediate and visceral. "This changes everything," she said, leaning back in her leather office chair. "Adultery, fraud, abandonment of a child he'd accepted as his own. David's going to have a very difficult time in court." "What are my options?" Patricia smiled grimly. "All of them. We can pursue adultery-based divorce proceedings, which will impact the property settlement significantly. We can also explore fraud charges related to his deception about the paternity test. And if we can prove he's been hiding assets in preparation for leaving with his girlfriend, we might be looking at criminal charges." The thought of destroying David's life through legal action should have brought me satisfaction, but instead, I felt oddly hollow. Revenge, I was learning, was less appealing in reality than in imagination. What I really wanted was answers, not just about David's motivations, but about my own role in the disaster our marriage had become. Before we proceed with anything, I told Patricia, I want to confront him directly. I want him to know that I know. "That's not advisable from a legal standpoint," she warned. "Anything he says in response could potentially be used against us, but it might also give him time to prepare counter-strategies." "I don't care about legal advantages," I said. "I need to look him in the eye and ask him why." Patricia sighed, but nodded. "If you're determined to do this, let me set some ground rules. No recording devices, no witnesses, no written communications beforehand. Keep it simple and direct. Ask your questions, listen to his answers, and then leave. Don't let it become an argument or negotiation." Finding David proved easier than expected. Rebecca Martinez's social media profiles, which she'd apparently forgotten to make private, provided a detailed trail of their new life in Denver. Photographs of hiking expeditions, restaurant dinners, and cozy apartment scenes painted a picture of domestic bliss that might have been enviable if it weren't built on the destruction of my family. David's new address was listed in the white pages, 1247, Maple Grove Drive in a trendy neighborhood near downtown Denver. According to his LinkedIn profile, he'd found work at a mid-sized accounting firm specializing in nonprofit organizations. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who'd abandoned his own child was now helping charitable organizations manage their finances. I arranged for Emma to spend the weekend with my parents, booked a Friday evening flight to Denver, and rented a car at the airport. By Saturday morning, I was sitting in that rental car outside David's new apartment building, gathering the courage to walk up to his door and demand an explanation for the devastation he'd left in his wake. The apartment complex was modern and soulless, all glass and steel rising from a carefully landscaped courtyard that looked like it had been designed by committee. David's unit was on the third floor, and through the large windows, I could see him moving around inside, preparing breakfast, presumably, given the early hour. He answered the door in pajama pants and a t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, looking older than his 42 years. The month since the christening had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth, and his dark hair was showing gray at the temples that I didn't remember seeing before. The shock on his face when he saw me was complete and genuine. His coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the tile floor and splashing dark liquid across his bare feet. "Sarah," he whispered, as if my name was a prayer or a curse. "Hello, David." We stood there for a long moment, taking each other's measure across the threshold of his new life. He looked like a man who'd been caught in a lie so fundamental that he'd forgotten what the truth even looked like. "How did you find me? Does it matter?" He stepped back, gesturing for me to enter his apartment. The space was impersonal and temporary feeling, furnished with the kind of rental pieces that spoke of someone not planning to stay long in any one place. A few framed photographs sat on the mantelpiece, Rebecca at various scenic locations, but none of Emma, none of our life together. "Where's Rebecca?" I asked, settling into an uncomfortable modern chair. "Work. She has Saturday shifts at the hospital here." So she'd found medical work in Denver, probably helped by connections David had made through his new job. They'd integrated themselves into a new community with remarkable efficiency, leaving virtually no traces of their previous lives behind. David sat across from me, his face pale and drawn. Up close, I could see that he'd lost weight, and there was a hollow look in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and uneasy conscience. "Why, David?" I asked simply. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. David opened his mouth several times as if to speak, then closed it again. Finally, he found his voice. "Because I knew she wasn't mine." "When did you know?" I suspected from the beginning. The timing was too close to Seattle. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that love could overcome biology. He paused, running his hands through his hair. I had the test done when Emma was 6 weeks old. Rebecca knew a lab technician who could process it quietly. And instead of talking to me about it, you decided to abandon us both. What was I supposed to say, Sarah? That I'd been playing father to another man's child? That our entire marriage was built on lies? The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to draw blood. I had lied, by omission if not commission. I'd allowed David to believe Emma was his daughter without ever voicing my own doubts about the paternity. You could have said anything, I replied. You could have asked me directly. You could have demanded honesty instead of hiring investigators and planning secret escapes. Would you have told me the truth? The question was fair, and I considered it carefully before answering. I don't know, but you never gave me the chance to find out. David stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the apartment complex's artificial lake. His reflection in the glass was ghostly and insubstantial. I loved her, he said quietly. Even knowing she wasn't mine biologically, I loved Emma. That's what made leaving so hard. Then why did you leave? Because Rebecca was right. Emma deserved a father who wanted to be there, not one who felt trapped by circumstances. And you deserved better than a husband who resented you for your choices. Did you resent me? Another long pause. Yes. Not for the affair, we worked through that. But for letting me fall in love with a child who wasn't mine without ever questioning whether I had the right to that love. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering ground that should have been explored months or even years earlier. David's motivations were complex and contradictory. Genuine love for Emma mixed with wounded pride, desire to do the right thing complicated by Rebecca's influence, and beneath it all, a fundamental lack of courage to confront difficult truths directly. As our discussion wound down, I found myself feeling something unexpected: pity. David had made choices that destroyed our family, but he'd also trapped himself in a life that clearly wasn't bringing him happiness. His new apartment felt like a way station rather than a home, and there was a restlessness in his manner that suggested he was still running from something he couldn't escape. There's something else you should know, I said as I prepared to leave. David looked up from the coffee-stained floor he'd been absently cleaning. Emma's biological father wants to be part of her life. The color drained from David's face entirely. You found him. I always knew who he was. I just never thought it mattered until you made it matter. And now Emma will have a father who chose her deliberately, instead of one who felt obligated to stay. I left David standing in his sterile apartment, surrounded by the fragments of his shattered coffee mug and the pieces of the life he'd thought he wanted. The conversation had provided some answers, but it had also raised new questions about forgiveness, responsibility, and the complex ways that love and biology intersect in creating families. The flight home gave me hours to process what I'd learned and to prepare for the next chapter of Emma's story and mine. Dr. James Sullivan arrived at my house on a crisp Saturday morning in early November, carrying a small gift bag and wearing the nervous expression of a man about to meet his daughter for the first time. Through the living room window, I watched him sit in his rental car for several minutes, gathering courage or perhaps just trying to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. Emma, now 4 months old, was in her bouncy seat, fascinated by the play of sunlight through the autumn leaves outside. She'd grown considerably since the christening, developing the chubby cheeks and bright alertness that made strangers stop us in grocery stores to comment on her beauty. Her dark eyes, James's eyes, I now knew, tracked movement with increasing focus, and her smile had become a reliable source of joy in our household. When James finally approached the front door, I could see the family resemblance immediately. Emma had inherited not just his eyes, but his olive skin tone and the particular way his mouth curved when he was thinking. The genetic connection was undeniable, written across both their faces in ways that made me wonder how I'd ever convinced myself she might be David's daughter. "She's beautiful," James said simply, setting down his gift bag and moving slowly toward Emma's seat. He didn't reach for her immediately, instead crouching down to her level and speaking in the gentle tones that pediatric surgeons learn to use with young patients. Emma studied his face with the serious concentration babies reserve for new experiences. After a moment, she smiled, not the reflexive social smile she'd recently mastered, but something deeper and more intentional, as if some primitive part of her brain recognized the genetic connection. "May I hold her?" James asked, and something in his voice made my throat tighten. I lifted Emma from her seat and placed her carefully in James's arms. He held her with the confident competence of someone accustomed to handling small, fragile beings, but his hands trembled slightly as Emma settled against his chest and gazed up at his face with those matching dark eyes. "Hello, little one," he whispered, and Emma responded by grasping his finger with surprising strength. The afternoon passed more easily than I'd anticipated. James was naturally good with babies, perhaps due to his medical training, and Emma seemed to sense his gentle nature. They spent time on the living room floor, James making silly faces while Emma giggled and reached for his stethoscope, which he brought specifically for her amusement. We talked carefully around the edges of our situation: Emma's feeding schedule, her recent developmental milestones, her personality quirks that were already emerging. James listened with the focused attention of someone trying to absorb months of missed experiences in a single afternoon. "What happens now?" he asked as the day wound down and Emma napped in his arms. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." "Neither have I. But I'd like to be part of her life, if you'll let me. Not as a replacement for David, but as her father." The word hung in the air between us, weighted with implications neither of us had fully considered. James was Emma's biological father, but fatherhood was more than genetics. It was late-night feedings and first words, scraped knees and bedtime stories, the thousand small moments that build the relationship between parent and child. "We'll take it slowly," I said finally. "Monthly visits at first, then we'll see how everyone adjusts." James nodded, understanding that trust would have to be earned over time. Unlike David, who had been handed the role of father and then abandoned it, James would have to prove his commitment to Emma's welfare through consistent presence and support. Over the following months, James became a regular fixture in our lives. He flew from Seattle to visit Emma twice a month, always bringing age-appropriate gifts and spending hours on the floor playing with blocks, reading board books, and marveling at each new skill she developed. More surprisingly, he became a source of support for me as well. James understood the complexities of professional life in ways David never had, and he offered practical help with everything from childcare arrangements to financial planning. When Emma came down with her first serious illness, a respiratory infection that required hospitalization, James used his medical connections to ensure she received the best possible care. But the most significant change in our lives came from an unexpected source. The church video that had exposed David's deception became a catalyst for justice in ways I never anticipated. Marcus Chin, the software engineer who'd first noticed the timestamp discrepancy, had shared the footage with his grandmother, who in turn mentioned it to other members of St. Matthew's congregation. Word spread through the church community that David's abandonment hadn't been a sudden crisis of faith, but a calculated betrayal planned in their sacred space. The congregation's response was swift and decisive. David found himself excommunicated not through formal church proceedings, but through the organic rejection of a community that had welcomed him and watched him destroy his family for another woman. His name was removed from church committees, his planned contributions to building projects were returned, and when he attempted to attend services during a visit to town, he was asked to leave by the ushers. More significantly, several church members with connections to the legal community offered their services pro bono to ensure David faced appropriate consequences for his actions. A forensic accountant discovered that David had been systematically transferring marital assets to accounts Rebecca could access, behavior that constituted fraud under state law. A private investigator found evidence that David had been conducting his affair in the marital home during business trips I thought he'd been taking alone. The legal case that resulted was comprehensive and devastating. David's attempts to portray himself as a confused husband who'd simply needed space crumbled under the weight of documented evidence showing months of calculated deception. Rebecca's role as co-conspirator was fully exposed, damaging her reputation in the medical community and leading to an ethics investigation by her licensing board. But perhaps the most satisfying development came from David's employer in Denver. The accounting firm that had hired him specialized in nonprofit organizations, and when they learned about his fraudulent behavior in abandoning his family responsibilities while conducting an affair, they terminated his employment immediately. Apparently, helping charities manage their finances required a higher standard of personal integrity than David could meet. By the time Emma celebrated her first birthday, David's carefully constructed new life had collapsed entirely. He'd returned to her hometown, taken a job with a firm that specialized in divorce and bankruptcy cases, fitting work for someone who'd experienced both, and was living in a studio apartment that made his previous accommodations look luxurious. Rebecca had moved on to another city and another relationship, apparently deciding that David's legal troubles made him a liability rather than a romantic prospect. The grand love affair that had justified destroying our marriage had lasted less than 8 months before reality intruded on their fantasy. Meanwhile, Emma thrived in ways that daily amazed me. She walked early, talked early, and displayed a sunny personality that drew people to her like flowers turning towards sunlight. James's regular presence in her life provided stability and male influence that balanced my more anxious maternal instincts. When she said "Dada" for the first time, it was while reaching for James during one of his weekend visits. The legal settlement from my divorce provided financial security that allowed me to reduce my work hours and spend more time with Emma. We moved to a smaller house closer to downtown, with a garden where Emma could play and a front porch that welcomed neighbors and friends. Father Morrison continued his regular visits, delighting in Emma's development and offering the kind of spiritual guidance that helped me process the complex emotions surrounding David's betrayal and James's emergence as a father figure. The church community embraced Emma as one of their own, creating the extended family support system that every child deserves. But the most profound change was internal. The woman who'd stood in St. Matthew's sanctuary 8 months earlier, devastated by her husband's abandonment, had been transformed by adversity into someone stronger and more self-reliant. I learned that love wasn't always enough to sustain a marriage, but that it was always enough to sustain a parent's commitment to her child. Emma would grow up knowing the truth about her parentage, that her biological father had chosen to love her despite complicated circumstances, while the man who'd raised her initially had chosen to leave when love became difficult. Both men had taught her important lessons about the nature of commitment and the difference between obligation and choice. As Emma's second Christmas approached, I found myself grateful for the church live stream camera that had accidentally captured David's betrayal. Without that evidence, I might have spent years wondering what I'd done wrong, questioning my worth as a wife and mother, allowing David's deception to poison my ability to trust and love again. Instead, I learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals contain the seeds of liberation. David's abandonment had freed me from a marriage built on lies and given Emma the chance to know her real father. The pain of that Sunday morning at St. Matthew's had been transformed into the foundation for a more authentic and fulfilling life. The truth, as Father Morrison had once told me, really could set you free, even when it arrived in the most unexpected package. 2 years after the christening that changed everything, I stood in the same Gothic sanctuary of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, but this time as a witness to joy rather than the victim of betrayal. Emma, now a chattering 2-year-old with dark curls and an impish smile, sat quietly in the front pew beside James, occasionally whispering "Mama," and pointing at me with the proprietary pride that made my heart swell. The occasion was my wedding to Dr. James Sullivan. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was marrying Emma's biological father in the same church where her christening had exposed the lies that destroyed my first marriage. But there was a profound sense of rightness about the setting, as if the sacred space was claiming the opportunity to host a ceremony built on truth rather than deception. Our courtship had been unconventional by any standard. Most couples don't begin dating after discovering they've co-created a child during a one-night stand years earlier. But James and I had built our relationship on the foundation of Emma's needs, learning to trust each other as parents before we ever considered becoming romantic partners. The transition from co-parents to lovers had been gradual and carefully negotiated. James had relocated to our town 6 months earlier, taking a position at the regional medical center that allowed him to be present for Emma's daily routine rather than just weekend visits. We'd attended couples counseling from the beginning, determined not to repeat the communication failures that had destroyed my marriage to David. Father Morrison, now in his 70s but still possessing the gentle wisdom that made him beloved by his congregation, performed the ceremony with the same reverence he'd brought to Emma's baptism 2 years earlier. His homily focused on the mysterious ways that God could bring good from difficult circumstances, transforming mistakes into blessings and turning endings into beginnings. The guest list was small but meaningful. My parents, who'd embraced James as the son-in-law they'd always hoped for. James's family from Seattle, including his sister and elderly mother, who'd fallen in love with Emma at first sight. Friends from church, work colleagues, neighbors who'd become like family during the difficult months after David's abandonment. Notably absent was any representation from David's side of the family. Rebecca had retained a lawyer and sued for visitation rights as Emma's psychological father, but the documented evidence of his planned abandonment had made his case hopeless from the start. The court had terminated his parental rights entirely, clearing the way for James to adopt Emma legally as his daughter. David himself had moved to another state, apparently seeking a fresh start in a place where his reputation hadn't preceded him. I occasionally received child support payments through the state system, but they were irregular and insufficient, more symbolic than practical. I'd stopped depending on his contributions long ago. Rebecca Martinez had also disappeared from our orbit, last seen posting social media pictures from somewhere in Texas with a new boyfriend and a carefully curated narrative about starting over after a difficult period. She'd never faced serious legal consequences for her role in David's deception, but her medical career had suffered enough damage to effectively end her prospects for advancement. As James and I exchanged vows in front of our small but supportive community, Emma began to fuss in the front pew. Without hesitation, Father Morrison paused the ceremony and invited her to join us at the altar. She toddled forward in her white dress, a miniature version of my own gown, and stood between James and me as we completed our promises to each other. Do you, Sarah, take James to be your husband? And do you both promise to love and care for Emma as your daughter together? We do, we answered in unison, and Emma clapped her hands with delight, as if she understood that this moment was making official what had already become true in our daily lives. The reception was held in the same parish hall where David had abandoned us 2 years earlier, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Instead of confused guests wondering where the groom had gone, we celebrated with people who'd witnessed our unconventional family's journey from crisis to healing. During the toasts, Marcus Chin surprised us by attending via video call from California. His grandmother, now 92 and still faithfully watching St. Matthew's services online, had insisted he participate in the celebration of the family his technical curiosity had helped create. Sometimes, Marcus said from his computer screen, paying attention to the small details reveals truths that change everything. I'm grateful that a timestamp error led to such a beautiful outcome. As the evening wound down and Emma fell asleep in James's arms, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd thought my life was ruined by betrayal and abandonment. I believed that David's departure represented the end of my dreams of family happiness. Instead, his betrayal had been the catalyst for discovering a love more authentic and sustaining than anything I'd experienced in my first marriage. James and I were partners in the truest sense, bound together not by romantic illusion but by shared commitment to Emma's welfare and mutual respect for each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. Emma would grow up in a home where honesty was valued over convenience, where difficult conversations were addressed directly rather than avoided, and where love was demonstrated through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. She would know her origin story, including the complicated circumstances of her conception, but she would also know that her parents had chosen each other deliberately, with full knowledge of their imperfections and shared dedication to building something lasting. The church live stream camera that had accidentally documented David's betrayal had been upgraded since our christening day, but it continued to faithfully record the significant moments in St. Matthew's community life. Somewhere in the digital archives, Emma's baptism, her parents' first wedding, and now her parents' second wedding existed as a testament to the unpredictable ways that endings can become beginnings. As we prepared to leave the reception, Father Morrison pulled me aside for a final blessing. You know, he said quietly, I've performed hundreds of weddings in this church, but I've never seen one that felt more like a celebration of God's grace. You and James have built something beautiful from very difficult circumstances. Thank you for believing in us, I replied, and for never making me feel ashamed of the mistakes that led us here. The only mistake, Father Morrison said with a smile, would have been letting shame prevent you from accepting the gifts that came from those circumstances. As we drove home through the familiar streets of our small town, Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat and James's hand warm in mine, I thought about the message I might send to other women facing similar betrayals. The pain of discovering a spouse's deception was real and devastating, but it wasn't necessarily the end of the story. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you creates space for the best thing to enter your life. Sometimes the betrayal that breaks your heart also breaks open the possibilities you never knew existed. Sometimes the man who abandons you makes room for the man who's been waiting to love you properly. But perhaps most importantly, sometimes the church live stream camera captures more than just a ceremony. It documents the moment when one chapter of your life ends and another, better chapter begins. Emma stirred in her sleep as we pulled into our driveway, and James carried her inside while I gathered the detritus of our wedding day, flowers that would be dried and pressed in a scrapbook, cards from friends expressing joy for our happiness, and photographs that would someday help Emma understand how her family came to be. The house felt different that night, blessed by the commitment James and I had made to each other and to Emma. We were no longer three people trying to figure out how to become a family. We were a family that had been tested by unusual circumstances and emerged stronger for the experience. As I tucked Emma into her crib, she opened her sleepy eyes and smiled at me with the trust and contentment that every parent hopes to see in their child's face. "Night-night, Mama," she whispered, and then, turning toward James who stood in the doorway, "Night-night, Daddy." The words that had once broken my heart, Emma calling David Daddy before he disappeared from her life, now filled me with peace. This time, the man she was calling Daddy had chosen to be there, had fought to earn the title, and would be present for all the moments David had elected to miss. Outside, snow began to fall on the church where our story had truly begun, covering the Gothic spires and stained glass windows with a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary challenges of married life, work schedules and household responsibilities, disagreements to negotiate and decisions to make together. But tonight, we were simply a family that had found each other through the most improbable circumstances, blessed by a community that had witnessed our journey, and grateful for the technology that had accidentally preserved the truth when we needed it most. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives are captured by cameras we didn't know were recording. Sometimes the evidence we need to move forward is hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone curious enough to notice the timestamp that doesn't quite match the official record. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, the worst betrayal we can imagine becomes the foundation for a love story more beautiful than anything we could have planned. In the end, David had been right about one thing. Emma deserved a father who truly wanted to be present. She just hadn't been destined to find that father in him. The live stream had revealed his deception, but it had also revealed something more valuable, the truth that would set us all free to become the family we were meant to be.